Dragons guarded the edges of the world on ancient maps. These medieval cartographers crafted worlds from parchment and pigment, blending what they saw with what they believed. Their maps did far more than show rivers and mountains. They fueled the ambitions of kings and sent ships across uncharted oceans. You will discover how phantom islands and mythical kingdoms directly shaped the course of real history, leading to exploration and empire. We will uncover why mapmakers filled blank spaces with monsters and how a legendary Christian king hidden in Asia altered global politics. What invisible lines on our own maps might be guiding our world today. The scratch of a quill was the only sound in the quiet room. Each map began not with a journey across land, but with the careful preparation of materials. A single sheet of parchment made from the skin of a sheep or a calf represented a significant investment. The mapmaker would scrape the skin clean and stretch it taut, creating a smooth, durable surface that could last for centuries. His inks were brewed in-house from a recipe as guarded as any secret. He would crush oak galls, the strange growths formed on trees by wasps, and mix them with iron salts to create a deep, black ink that would resist fading. For color, he turned to his most precious possessions. Lapis lazuli, a stone hauled from distant mines, was ground into a brilliant blue powder for the oceans. Vermilion, made from cinnabar, provided a fiery red for important texts and royal coats of arms. Every material was chosen not just for its beauty, but for its permanence, meant to capture a vision of the world for all time. The very shape of the world on the page was dictated by tradition. The most common framework was the T and O map. Imagine a perfect circle representing the entire known world. Inside this circle, a T-shaped body of water divides the three continents. The vertical stem of the T is the Mediterranean Sea, cleaving Europe from Africa. The crossbar at the top is formed by the river Don on one side and the Nile on the other, separating Asia from the north. This was not a map for navigation, but a diagram of divine order. Jerusalem sat at the very center, the spiritual heart of the world, while East was placed at the top, the direction of paradise. Accuracy was secondary to this symbolic truth. The mapmaker was not trying to depict the world as a sailor might see it, but as a scholar believed it should be, a perfect reflection of both scripture and classical learning. His work was an act of compilation, not exploration. He would gather every source he could find, from the ancient Greek texts of Ptolemy to the often exaggerated accounts of merchants and pilgrims. One traveler might speak of men with faces on their chests, another of a river of gold. The mapmaker, with no way to verify these tales, faced a choice. To leave a space blank was an admission of ignorance, a void that challenged the completeness of God's creation. So he filled the voids. He populated the edges of Asia with the mythical kingdom of Prester John, a lost Christian emperor rumored to possess a fountain of youth. He drew islands like St. Brendan's Isle, a phantom paradise said to have been discovered by an Irish monk. These were not considered lies, but possibilities, filling the gaps in knowledge with the substance of faith and story. The result was a breathtaking object, part science, part art, and part theology, a parchment world that felt more real and far more wondrous than the one outside the monastery walls. Yet one of the most persistent visions to emerge from that parchment world was an island that was not there at all. For centuries, sailors and scholars spoke of St. Brendan's Isle, a phantom paradise lost somewhere in the vast Atlantic mists. Its origins lay with a 6th century Irish monk, St. Brendan, who was said to have sailed west and discovered a land of impossible wonders. On maps, this island evolved into a place of eternal spring, where fruits hung heavy on branches that never lost their leaves and rivers carved channels through beds of glittering jewels. This was not pure fantasy, but a powerful fusion of older Celtic myths of a land of youth with the Christian hope for an earthly paradise. The idea of such a blessed place waiting just beyond the horizon proved irresistible. It began to appear on serious navigational charts, a solid shape drawn with confidence amidst the empty, unknown waters of the ocean. Why would a cartographer include a place he had never seen? Because the absence of it felt like a greater error. To leave the Atlantic blank was to admit defeat, but to draw St. Brendan's Isle was to offer hope, a destination for the soul as much as for the ship. This spiritual legend became a tangible goal. Explorers set sail not just for spices or gold, but in search of this holy island, their voyages funded by patrons who believed the story. Each expedition that ventured west, hoping to find a monk's mythical paradise, was inadvertently pushing the map a little further, charting real currents and actual coastlines while chasing a dream. The search for a Christian fairy tale quietly and profoundly expanded the boundaries of the real world. While one phantom island lured ships westward, another legend took root deep in the east. Far beyond the lands of the known world, in the heart of Asia or the depths of Africa, medieval maps depicted a kingdom of unimaginable splendor, ruled by a figure known as Prester John. He was a priest and a king, a Christian monarch who commanded armies so vast they could crush any enemy. His realm was said to be a paradise on earth, flowing with rivers of gold and silver, home to the fountain of youth itself, and guarded by creatures from the most vivid dreams, like men with the heads of dogs or giants who could block out the sun. This was not just a story for entertainment. For a Europe that saw itself as a Christian fortress surrounded by powerful Islamic empires, the legend of Prester John was a divine promise. It offered a single, electrifying hope that a mighty ally was waiting behind enemy lines, ready to join a holy war and turn the tide of history. This belief was so powerful because it arrived with what seemed like proof. In the 12th century, a letter, supposedly from Prester John himself, began to circulate through the courts of Europe. It described his kingdom in breathtaking detail, from its palace made of crystal to its subjects who lived for hundreds of years. The letter was almost certainly a forgery, a masterpiece of medieval propaganda, but it was believed with absolute sincerity by popes and kings. They now had a name and an address for their savior. This cartographic fiction began to dictate real-world strategy. Pope Alexander III sent a personal envoy carrying a letter eastward, seeking an alliance with this phantom king. More than 2 centuries later, Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, directed his explorers down the coast of Africa with one clear instruction: find the kingdom of Prester John and secure his aid against their common foes. Every voyage launched in his name, every diplomat sent into the unknown, was a direct result of lines drawn on a map and a story told so well it became truth. The search for this mythical ally did not discover his golden cities, but it did force open the doors to continents Europeans had never known, changing the map of the world forever in the pursuit of a man who never was. Far to the south, another imagined landmark cast a long shadow over the real world. The source of the Nile River was one of the greatest geographical mysteries of all time, a puzzle that confounded the greatest minds from ancient Rome to the medieval world. To solve it, mapmakers drew a solution from pure logic. They sketched a vast, snow-capped mountain range deep in the heart of Africa, the legendary Mountains of the Moon. The Greek geographer Ptolemy had written of them centuries earlier, suggesting their melting snows fed great lakes that were the ultimate source of the Nile. This was a brilliant guess, an attempt to explain how a river could flow through the blistering Sahara without ever drying up. It made perfect sense, and so it was copied, refined, and permanently inked onto parchment. The famous Arab cartographer Al-Idrisi placed them on his world map, showing lakes at their base that fed not only the Nile flowing north but also a great river flowing west. This was not wild fantasy, but a reasoned hypothesis, the best possible answer with the information available, and once it was on the map, it became a fact. For over 1,000 years, every European scholar who looked at a map of Africa saw those mountains. They were as real as the Alps or the Pyrenees, a fixed feature of the continent's geography. This cartographic consensus did more than fill a blank space. It created a destination. Generations of explorers armed with these maps pushed into the African interior with one primary goal: to find the fabled mountains and confirm the ancient theory. Their journeys were not random. They were directed by lines drawn centuries before, a ghostly range guiding every step. The quest to find these non-existent peaks ultimately led explorers through deadly swamps and up real rivers, forcing them to map the actual, complex geography of Central Africa. The myth of the Mountains of the Moon, a testament to the power of a good idea, inadvertently charted the course for revealing the continent's true heart. A single sheet of vellum in Hereford Cathedral holds one of the most magnificent visions of the medieval world. Created around the year 1300, the Hereford Mappa Mundi is not a tool for travelers but a sprawling spiritual encyclopedia. Its design is immediately striking, a perfect circle with east placed firmly at the top. This orientation is not a mistake. It deliberately positions the Garden of Eden at the very apex of the world, the starting point of all human history. At the exact center of this cosmic diagram sits the city of Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of creation and the site of humanity's redemption. Every line drawn on this skin was intended to teach a lesson. The map is crammed with illustrations that form a visual library of knowledge. You can find the Tower of Babel reaching for the heavens, the parting of the Red Sea, and the adventures of Alexander the Great, all sharing space with strange beings believed to inhabit the Earth's remote corners. Here you might encounter the Blemii, a race of headless men with their faces set upon their chests, or the Cyapods, who possessed a single, massive foot they used to shade themselves from the sun. These were not included as fanciful decorations. For the medieval mind, these creatures were as real as any king or pope, living proof of God's boundless and sometimes bizarre creativity. The map functioned as a powerful visual sermon for a population that could not read. A priest could use it to walk his congregation through the entire story of Christian history, from humanity's fall in Eden at the top of the map to its potential salvation in Jerusalem at the center. It presented a complete cosmology, showing every person their own small but significant place within God's grand design. To understand geography was to understand Scripture, and to know the world was to know the mind of its creator. This profound connection between faith and cartography shaped more than just personal belief. It forged the very ideologies that would send empires searching for earthly paradises and phantom kings. The quiet hum of a monastery scriptorium was the sound of the world being saved. In these hushed rooms, the work of preservation was a sacred duty. Monks bent over their desks, their hands carefully tracing the words of ancient authors like Pliny and Pomponius Mela, ensuring that the geographical knowledge of Greece and Rome would not be lost to time. These classical texts described a world of pagan gods and strange races, a vision that needed to be reconciled with the truth of the Bible. So the monks did not merely copy, they reinterpreted. They wove the classical geography into a new Christian tapestry, placing the Garden of Eden at the top of the world and Jerusalem at its heart. The resulting maps were not intended to guide a traveler from one city to another, but to guide a soul toward salvation. They were created for contemplation within the monastery walls or as lavish commissions for wealthy nobles and bishops. This was a profoundly controlled environment. Every line drawn, every creature sketched in the margins, was filtered through a singular lens of faith. A classical account of a cyclops was not dismissed as myth, but included as evidence of God's diverse creation. A description of a distant eastern kingdom was framed as a potential land awaiting conversion. The scriptorium became the cradle for a specific kind of geography, one where faith dictated fact. It was here, amidst the scent of ink and parchment, that the imagined landscapes that would guide kings and empires were carefully, deliberately, and devoutly born. While European monks charted a world of faith, a revolution in precision was unfolding in the royal court of Sicily. Here, in a unique kingdom where Arab, Norman, and Greek cultures mingled, the scholar Muhammad Al-Idrisi was given a monumental task by the Christian king Roger II. His mission was not to illustrate scripture, but to compile the entire known world onto a single, definitive map. For 15 years, Al-Idrisi and his team of scholars interviewed travelers, cross-referenced Greek texts like Ptolemy's geography, and collected the first-hand accounts of Arab merchants who had sailed from the coast of Africa to the ports of China. This was geography built on testimony and mathematics, not symbolism. The result was the Tabula Rogeriana, a map of stunning insight engraved on a massive silver plate, a material chosen for its permanence and immense value. This was not a diagram for prayer, but a tool for a king's governance and a testament to human knowledge. Al-Idrisi's map presented a spherical world, a concept well understood in the Islamic scholarly tradition but often forgotten in Europe. It correctly showed the Indian Ocean as an open sea, not a landlocked lake as many European maps insisted. The coastlines of Africa, the Mediterranean, and even parts of Asia were rendered with an accuracy that would not be rivaled for centuries. His work came with a detailed book of geography, explaining the climates, cultures, and major cities of 70 distinct regions. This masterpiece did not remain in one court. It circulated widely, a bridge between worlds. Christian rulers studied it, Islamic scholars praised it, and its more scientific view of the world slowly seeped into the European consciousness. The Tabula Rogeriana stood as powerful proof that when knowledge was shared across cultures, the blank spaces on the map did not need to be filled with monsters, they could be filled with facts. These creatures were far more than decorative flourishes. The dog-headed cynosphali and the single-footed cyapods were placed with deliberate purpose along the borders of the known world, marking the absolute limits of the familiar. They transformed blank spaces into lands of active, terrifying danger, defining the civilized self by illustrating the monstrous other. This was a powerful psychological tool that turned ignorance into a weapon. A king or a bishop looking at such a map would not see empty land ripe for trade, but a realm of chaos that demanded order, a spiritual void that cried out for the light of the cross. The monsters were a moral argument rendered in ink and color. They suggested that the people living in these distant regions were not merely different, but subhuman, perhaps even demonic. This belief made the prospect of conquest seem less like an act of aggression and more like a sacred duty, a crusade to reclaim the world from the grip of the unnatural. The justification for empire was being quietly drawn on parchment long before the first ships were ever built. When explorers finally landed on distant shores, they carried these mental maps with them, and they often saw the local inhabitants not as fellow human beings, but as the living embodiments of the dog-headed men and giants from their charts. This cartographic propaganda had real and tragic consequences. paving the way for centuries of subjugation under the banner of civilization and salvation. A simple line drawn across a map could condemn an entire continent. Medieval cartography inherited from the Greeks a powerful and deceptively simple idea: the division of the world into 5 distinct climate zones. On a typical world map, you would see 2 frozen bands at the top and bottom, deemed too cold for any human life. Below them lay 2 temperate zones, perfect for civilization. And slicing through the very center of the world was the torrid zone, a blistering belt of fire around the equator that was thought to be a scorched and impassable wasteland. This was not just a theory about weather, it was a theory about people. Europe, of course, sat squarely within the northern temperate zone, the perfect cradle for mankind. The lands to the south, however, fell under the burning sun of the torrid zone. This geographical model provided a seemingly scientific reason to believe that Africa was fundamentally uninhabitable, or at best populated only by monstrous beings warped by the extreme heat. It transformed a blank space on the map into a space of inevitable desolation. Why would anyone risk a voyage into a furnace? The zonal theory offered a clean, logical answer: they should not. It was a cartographic cage, locking entire hemispheres away behind a wall of presumed knowledge. This logic provided a powerful justification for the emerging worldview of European empires. If their part of the world was, by nature's own design, the only one fit for advanced society, then their eventual dominance over other, supposedly lesser, regions was not an act of conquest, but a simple fulfillment of a geographical destiny. The maps that displayed these zones were not merely describing the world, they were prescribing a hierarchy, with Europe naturally at the top. The eventual voyages that shattered this theory were acts of profound courage. When Portuguese sailors first began inching down the west coast of Africa, their greatest fear was not sea monsters but the sun itself. They believed that as they crossed into the torrid zone, their ships would burst into flame and the very sea would begin to boil. Yet with each passing mile, the water remained cool and their decks intact. They did not find a barren desert but lush, green coastlines and thriving kingdoms. The simple, devastating truth of reality began to erase a 1,000-year-old lie from the map, but the idea behind the zones proved harder to kill than the zones themselves. The conviction of geographical and thus racial superiority, first sketched in those classical climate bands, had already sunk deep roots, outlasting the maps that gave it birth and steering the course of empire long after the torrid zone was proven to be a myth. While the Mappa Mundi was a sermon for the soul, the Portolan chart was a manual for the mariner. These were not beautiful abstractions meant for a cathedral wall, but tough, grease-stained working documents kept in the chart rooms of Mediterranean sailing ships. Drawn on durable sheepskin parchment, their most striking feature was a spiderweb of lines radiating from central compass roses. These were room lines, the secret to their incredible utility. A sailor could simply lay a ruler along one of these lines from his current port to his destination, note the compass bearing, and set his course with a new level of confidence. The coastlines of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea were rendered with a startling accuracy born of countless voyages. Every bay, headland, and safe harbor meticulously recorded from direct experience. These maps spoke the language of survival, marking submerged rocks, sandy shoals, and the best anchorages. They were instruments of pure function, and their function was wealth. The great merchant republics of Genoa and Venice depended on these charts to weave their commercial empires across the sea, turning the Mediterranean into a well-mapped highway for spices, silk, and gold. The most magnificent example of this practical art is the Catalan Atlas of 1375, created by the Jewish cartographer Abraham Cresques. it was a masterpiece of information. It took the detailed coastlines of a Portolan and expanded them inland, painting a vibrant picture of global commerce. You can follow the snaking routes of camel caravans across the Sahara, see illustrations of the immense wealth of the Mali Empire with its Emperor Mansa Musa holding a golden nugget, and trace the sea lanes connecting Europe to Africa and Asia. This was not just a map for sailing, it was a strategic briefing for kings. It showed where the money was and, more importantly, how to get it. Portolan charts became the indispensable tools for the next great wave of exploration. In the hands of Portuguese navigators venturing down the African coast and Spanish captains daring to cross the Atlantic, these precise coastal maps provided the foundational knowledge and the navigational confidence to leave the known world behind. They were the quiet, practical engines of empire, translating the direct observation of a ship's pilot into the lines on a chart that would ultimately guide the course of conquest. The clash of steel and the scent of foreign spices marked a violent turning point for the European mind. For 2 centuries, the Crusades sent a flood of knights, pilgrims, and merchants eastward, and they returned with stories that could not be contained within the old symbolic maps. These were not scholars interpreting ancient texts, but soldiers who had marched the dusty roads to Jerusalem and sailors who had navigated the treacherous coasts of the Levant. They brought back a torrent of practical, first-hand knowledge, describing the true lay of the land, the real distances between cities, and the complex cultures that thrived beyond Christendom. The world was suddenly and irrevocably larger and more complicated than the monastery scriptoriums had ever suggested. This influx of new information created an urgent, practical demand. A noble planning a pilgrimage or a merchant financing a voyage no longer wanted a beautiful diagram of salvation. They needed a functional guide that could get them to Acre or Alexandria alive. Mapmakers were suddenly forced to reconcile the spiritual certainty of the T and O map with the messy, tangible reality described by returning travelers. The old framework strained under the weight of this new data. Jerusalem remained fixed at the center of their world maps, but now it was a real city with streets and walls, a place that could be conquered, lost, and fought over. This collision of faith and fact did not diminish the city's importance. It intensified it, transforming it from a symbolic heart into a tangible prize that had to be controlled. The very act of crusading, of traveling across the world to reclaim holy ground, cemented Jerusalem's dual role as both the spiritual and the literal center of the European worldview. The maps that emerged from this era became hybrid creations, layered with both pious symbolism and hard-won geographical insight, reflecting a world that was at once expanding and contracting, filled with new possibilities and newly defined enemies. Another phantom island haunted the charts of the Atlantic, a circular realm of mist and mystery known as Hy-Brasil. Said to lie somewhere off the western coast of Ireland, this enchanted land was cloaked in sea fog, revealing itself to the world only once every 7 years. Its name, steeped in Celtic lore meaning the Isle of the Blessed, would echo through history, possibly even giving its name to a far-off South American country. The promise of this hidden world proved irresistible to the ambitious mariners of the 15th century. Documented expeditions set sail with the express purpose of finding its shrouded shores. The renowned explorer John Cabot himself, after his landmark voyage to Newfoundland, became fixated on locating Hy-Brasil, convinced it lay within his reach. These were not fool's errands, but serious, funded ventures chasing a cartographic ghost. Each voyage that swept the empty Atlantic for the island was a masterclass in open ocean navigation. Sailors learned to read the subtle shifts in wind, to understand the complex flow of currents like the Gulf Stream, and to endure the vast, featureless expanse of the sea. They were honing their craft, building a deep, intuitive knowledge of the ocean's moods and mysteries. The very act of hunting for a myth was providing them with the irreplaceable, real-world experience needed to tackle an even greater challenge. The skills perfected in the futile search for Hy-Brasil, the improved ship designs, and the hardened confidence of the crews created the perfect foundation. When the time came to sail beyond the horizon into truly unknown waters, these mariners were ready. The phantom island they never found had, in the end, given them the means to discover a new world. The Ebstorf map was a cathedral of vellum and ink, a sprawling vision of the world so immense it could cover a wall. Created in the 13th century by the monks of a German convent, this masterpiece was tragically consumed by fire during the Second World War, leaving only copies to whisper of its grandeur. To stand before it would have been to witness the entire cosmos in a single gaze. But this was not merely a map of lands and seas, it was a map of the body of Christ. The world itself was drawn as his form, his head at the top in the east near paradise, his hands reaching to the north and south, and his wounded feet at the bottom in the west. Every river was a vein, every mountain a bone, and every city a part of a living, divine whole. This was the ultimate cartographic statement that the physical earth was quite literally embodied by God, and that to know geography was to know the Savior himself. With over 2,000 illustrations and inscriptions, the map served as a massive encyclopedia. A person could trace the route of the Exodus, locate the tomb of a saint, or marvel at a giraffe, all within the limbs of Christ. It was a complete system of knowledge, where a description of a city's walls stood beside a scene from the life of King David. There was no distinction between a geographical fact and a theological truth. They were one and the same, woven together into a single, sacred narrative. This totalizing vision provided more than just information. It offered a profound sense of place and purpose. It told every viewer, from the illiterate peasant to the learned bishop, exactly where they stood in relation to both Jerusalem and to heaven. The destruction of the Ebstorf map is a loss that echoes beyond art. It is the silencing of a worldview. Its memory forces us to recognize that every map, including our own, is more than a collection of data. It is an argument about what matters, a story about who we are and how we believe the world is put together. The lines we draw are never just lines, they are the shape of our deepest convictions. Gold and silk flowed along lines carefully inked onto parchment. A late medieval mapmaker did not just draw coastlines, he charted the very arteries of wealth and power. On masterworks like the Catalan Atlas, you could trace the Silk Road as a thin, determined line crossing deserts and mountains, a terrestrial vein carrying the luxury of Chinese silk and porcelain westward. Another route snaked across the vast blankness of the Sahara, connecting the gold fields of West Africa to the markets of the Mediterranean. And across the Indian Ocean, sea lanes were etched like highways, bustling with the ships that carried precious spices from their island sources. These were not passive decorations, they were active diagrams of desire, showing kings and merchants exactly where the world's riches were born and how they traveled. To control one of these lines was to hold your hand on the throat of commerce itself. The map transformed abstract economic concepts into a clear, visual strategy. A ruler could look at this painted parchment and understand that the wealth of his rivals depended on a single mountain pass or a vulnerable stretch of sea. He could see that the mysterious East was not a land of monsters, but a complex network of producers and markets, and that his own kingdom was at the hungry end of the chain. This visualization created an urgent, strategic imperative. Why should his treasury be drained to pay for spices that passed through a dozen middlemen? Why should he rely on the goodwill of rival powers who controlled the land routes? The map provided the answer, and the answer was to find another way. It directly fueled the age of exploration, not as a blind leap into the unknown, but as a calculated end run around a mapped economic system. The voyages of Da Gama and Columbus were, at their heart, attempts to redraw these very lines to reach the sources of wealth directly and seize control of the veins on the body of the world. In a Venetian monastery overlooking the lagoon, a monk was quietly dismantling the ancient world. Fra Mauro, working in the 1450s, was creating a map so revolutionary it would serve as a bridge from medieval faith to modern fact. His great planisphere, a massive circular map drawn on parchment, was a direct challenge to 1500 years of accepted wisdom. He openly questioned the authority of Ptolemy, the great Greek geographer whose work had been the unchallenged foundation of European geography. Where Ptolemy stated the Indian Ocean was a landlocked sea, Fra Mauro wrote directly on his map that this was likely wrong. He boldly suggested Africa could be sailed around, a hypothesis that would soon be proven by Vasco da Gama's voyage. This was not a mere update, it was a cartographic rebellion. Fra Mauro's workshop became a clearinghouse for the world's knowledge. He devoured the accounts of Arab traders and the meticulous charts of Islamic cartographers. He integrated the groundbreaking report of the Venetian merchant Niccolò da Conti, who had spent decades traveling through India and Southeast Asia. This flood of new data allowed Fra Mauro to depict places like China and the island of Java with a startling new precision, rendering them not as mythical lands but as real, complex civilizations. Yet the old world still whispered from the parchment. He carefully noted the legend of Prester John, that enduring dream of a Christian ally in the East, showing how difficult it was to fully let go of comforting myths. The Fra Mauro map is a portrait of a mind in transition, a moment where empirical evidence began to overwrite ancient authority. It was a tool crafted not for prayer, but for action, its lines drawn from travelers' logs and sailors' charts directly informing the princes and explorers who would soon launch the age of discovery. The map itself became a catalyst, its bold ideas about a navigable Africa giving navigators the confidence to attempt the impossible. That empty space on the map was a siren's call. Terra incognita, the simple Latin phrase for unknown land, was far more than an admission of ignorance. It was a declaration of possibility. These blank regions, often decorated with gentle swirls of color or curling scrolls, held a profound psychological sway over anyone who looked upon them. They were not voids of nothingness, but realms of pure potential where every fear and every fantasy could take root. For a king tracing his finger across the parchment, that emptiness was a challenge to his power and his legacy. It whispered of gold mines waiting to be dug, of vast populations ready for conversion to the one true faith, and of territories that could extend his dynasty's name to the very edges of the created world. The Mapmaker, by leaving a space blank, had not failed in his duty. He had issued an invitation. This invitation was framed as a sacred quest. The unknown lands were not just unconquered, they were unsaved. They existed outside the light of Christian revelation, populated, according to the map's own marginalia, by monstrous races in need of redemption or destruction. To venture into terra incognita was therefore a dual mission, serving both God and gold. This spiritual justification transformed raw ambition into a holy cause, making the act of expansion a moral imperative for any devout monarch. The map became a scorecard for imperial rivalry. In the courts of Portugal, Spain, England, and France, these charts were state secrets, closely guarded and constantly updated. When one kingdom received a report of a new coastline or a rumored passage, the others scrambled to catch up. The blank spaces fueled a frantic competition, a race to be the first to replace the words terra incognita with the name of a saint or the crest of a royal house. Each new expedition was an attempt to answer the map's silent, compelling question, to turn the unknown into the known, and in doing so, to claim a piece of the future for oneself. A king's agent could have unrolled the Go map and known with startling clarity exactly how to ride from London to York. Drawn around 1360, this map of Britain feels like it belongs to a different era entirely. Here, the world is not a divine circle centered on Jerusalem, but a practical, elongated landmass, its coastline rendered in a form we can instantly recognize today. A web of thin red lines stitches the kingdom together, each one a road measured not in leagues but in the reality of travel. This was a tool built for the business of rule. A royal official could trace a route for tax collectors, ensuring revenue flowed efficiently to the crown. A military commander could plan the movement of troops, understanding the distances between fortified towns. The very existence of such a map signals a profound shift in power. Control was no longer just about faith or feudal loyalty, it was about information. To govern a kingdom effectively, the state needed to see its own bones, its rivers, its roads, and its cities laid bare upon a page. This was cartography in the service of bureaucracy, a quiet revolution that traded theological certainty for administrative precision. The Go map represents a moment when rulers realized that to command men, they first had to command the map. This new, practical geography would become the essential blueprint for the modern state, and eventually for the empires those states would build across the globe. A forgotten masterpiece lay dormant in Constantinople for 1,000 years. Ptolemy's Geographia, a work of staggering sophistication from the 2nd century, was utterly unknown to the mapmakers of medieval Europe. While they sketched their symbolic T and O diagrams, this ancient text offered a radically different vision of the craft, one built on mathematics and a spherical earth. Its arrival in Italy by the early 15th century, carried by scholars fleeing a crumbling Byzantine empire, was an intellectual earthquake. European humanists, hungry for rediscovered classical knowledge, feverishly translated the Greek text into Latin. They were stunned by what they found. Ptolemy did not just describe the world, he provided a precise system for drawing it. He laid out a global grid of latitude and longitude, a coordinate system that could plot any city, any river, any coastline onto a curved surface with mathematical consistency. This was the death knell for the T and O map. How could you place Jerusalem at the center of a grid that wrapped around a sphere? The old symbolic order simply could not survive this new, precise logic. The impact was immediate and profound. For the first time, a mapmaker could take a traveler's description of a place, note its coordinates, and position it accurately in relation to every other known point on the globe. This was no longer an act of faith, but one of calculation. The invention of the printing press then supercharged this revolution. Suddenly, identical copies of Ptolemy's maps could be produced and distributed across the continent, creating a standardized, authoritative view of the world for the educated elite. Yet there was a deep irony in this new authority. Ptolemy's data was often wildly outdated. His world was the world of the Roman Empire, and he had drastically underestimated the size of the Earth, making Asia appear much closer to Europe than it truly was. This very error, however, would later fuel the ambitions of a Genos explorer named Christopher Columbus. More important than his mistakes was his method. A new generation of cartographers, armed with Ptolemy's mathematical framework, now had the tools to correct the master himself. Figures like Martin Waldseemüller began creating world maps that used Ptolemy's projections but incorporated new data from recent voyages. They were no longer just copying, they were building, using an ancient skeleton to flesh out a modern body of knowledge. This cartographic precision, this ability to chart a course across an open ocean with mathematical confidence, was the final, essential ingredient. It provided the navigational certainty required to attempt a voyage across the Atlantic or around the Cape of Good Hope, directly enabling the transoceanic empires that would soon reshape the globe. That serpent coiled around the border of a rival kingdom was never just a monster. It was a carefully placed argument. The dragons, dog-headed men, and giants inhabiting the edges of medieval maps were more than flights of fancy. They were potent tools of political propaganda. A mapmaker in the employ of a European monarch could subtly undermine a foreign power by populating its territories with illustrations of savage beasts and monstrous races. This visual language sent a clear, unspoken message to any nobleman or bishop who studied the parchment. It implied that those lands were realms of chaos, their people less than human, and their rulers perhaps in league with the devil himself. This was cartographic character assassination, a way to demonize an enemy without ever drawing a sword. The inverse was equally powerful. The king's own domains would be depicted as a serene and orderly garden, free from such grotesque inhabitants. His cities were drawn with precise walls and soaring cathedrals, his countryside dotted with peaceful villages and fertile fields. This stark contrast between civilized self and monstrous other was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to justify future conquests. By framing foreign lands as wildernesses crying out for order, the map provided a moral and ideological pretext for invasion. Claiming territory became less about greed and more about a sacred duty to tame the savage and spread the light of civilization. A map could thus launch 1,000 ships, not by charting a course but by painting a target. It transformed ambition into righteousness, making the lines on a parchment the opening salvo in a war of ideas. Even the most convincing forgery begins with a powerful truth. The Vinland map, unveiled to the world in the 1950s, seemed to rewrite history itself. Drawn on what appeared to be medieval parchment, it depicted a rugged coastline west of Greenland labeled Vinland. Here was stunning proof, it seemed, that a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson had reached North America centuries before Christopher Columbus, and that a 15th century cartographer had recorded it. The map caused an international sensation, celebrated as a priceless relic of pre-Columbian discovery. It validated a narrative that many wanted to believe, that European feet had touched the New World long before the voyages of 1492. But the map's greatest deception was not its lines, but its ink. Modern scientific analysis revealed the terrible truth. The map's distinctive yellow-brown ink contained a form of titanium dioxide, a synthetic pigment that was not commercially produced until the 1920s. The parchment was genuinely old, but the drawing was a modern fake, a brilliant and deliberate forgery crafted to deceive the world. The controversy itself is profoundly revealing. It exposes our deep-seated desire to find objective truth in old maps, to see them as neutral records free from agenda. We want to believe the parchment. The forger understood this psychology perfectly, exploiting our collective yearning for a tangible link to a romanticized past. This was not just a crime against art, but a manipulation of history itself, executed for a mix of potential profit and undeniable prestige. The Vinland map stands as a permanent cautionary tale. It reminds us that maps have always been susceptible to manipulation, whether by a medieval monk enhancing the glory of a patron king or a 20th century con artist seeking fame. The power of a map has never resided solely in its accuracy, but in its perceived authority, in our innate willingness to trust the world as it is drawn for us. This single, fraudulent sheet of vellum teaches a vital lesson for our own information-saturated age. We must scrutinize the maps we are given, for every chart is a story, and every storyteller has a motive. The parchment world created a legal reality before a single ship ever landed. When European explorers finally stepped onto the shores of the Americas, they encountered a profound contradiction. These were not empty lands, but thriving, complex civilizations with their own cities, governments, and cultures. To reconcile this reality with their desire for conquest, they invoked a powerful legal principle, the Doctrine of Discovery. This 15th century papal decree essentially granted Christian nations the right to claim any territory not ruled by a Christian monarch. It framed the entire non-Christian world as terra nullius, a legal term meaning nobody's land, open for the taking. How could such a flawed idea be accepted so readily? The answer lies in the maps they had studied for generations. For centuries, European cartography had been performing a quiet act of erasure. Regions beyond Christendom were consistently depicted as either vast, invitingly blank spaces, or as domains inhabited by the monstrous races you saw in the margins. These maps created a powerful mental shorthand. If a land was not filled with cities that looked like Paris or Rome, if its people were not depicted as fully human, then for all practical and legal purposes, it was considered empty. The humanity of millions was simply cartographically voided. This was not an accidental oversight, it was a conceptual precondition for empire. A Spanish conquistador holding a royal charter could look at the intricate social order of the Aztec or Inca empires and with a clear conscience see only wilderness awaiting civilization. The maps had taught him that the people before him were not sovereign nations, but part of the landscape to be tamed, converted, or removed. The lines and monsters drawn by monks centuries earlier had hardened into international law, providing the moral and legal alibi for one of the greatest dispossessions in human history. The fiction on the map became a tragedy on the ground, all because a blank space was easier to claim than a populated one. A swirling vortex of teeth and tentacles churns the frigid waters off Norway's coast. In 1539, the Swedish cleric Olaus Magnus unveiled his Carta Marina, a stunningly detailed map of the Nordic world that was less a navigational aid and more a terrifying field guide to the monstrous inhabitants of the deep. He filled the ocean with creatures born from a perfect storm of fear and fragmentary fact. A colossal whale is mistaken for a floating island, its barnacled back sprouting trees where unwary sailors light their cooking fires, only to be dragged to their doom when the beast dives. A giant lobster, its claws large enough to snap a ship's mast, prowls the shallows. Most terrifying of all is the sea serpent, a leviathan so vast its coils are said to encircle an entire ship, crushing the hull into splinters. These were not pure inventions. They were the logical conclusion of sailors' stories, the only source of information for these uncharted waters. A walrus, with its bizarre tusks and bellowing roar, became a tusked demon of the waves. A giant squid, glimpsed in a death struggle with a whale, was immortalized as the many-armed kraken. The map was a masterpiece of maritime horror, a visual collection of every whispered warning ever spoken in a northern port. Yet its purpose was more profound than simple fright. By so meticulously cataloguing the dangers of the Scandinavian seas, Olaus Magnus was performing a powerful act of political possession. He was defining that space, claiming its unique identity and its formidable challenges for his own culture. To know the monsters by name and form was to assert a kind of mastery over them, to transform a blank, anonymous expanse into a known, if deadly, Scandinavian domain. The map declared that these treacherous waters, with all their wonders and horrors, belonged to the northern kingdoms, a space they alone could navigate and understand. The Carta Marina did not just warn sailors away, it invited the world to look upon the fierce majesty of the north and recognize its sovereign power. The printed page finally tamed the monster-filled margins. Before the clatter of the printing press, a map was a singular treasure, painstakingly copied by hand in a quiet scriptorium. Each one was unique, subject to the beliefs and errors of its individual creator, a world seen through one pair of eyes. But in the middle of the 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg's invention shattered that model. Suddenly, a single, authoritative map could be replicated 100 times, 1,000 times, each copy perfectly identical to the last. This was a revolution in consistency. A merchant in Lisbon and a ship captain in Genoa could now be looking at the very same chart, discussing the very same coastline, plotting a joint venture with a shared understanding of the world. The most famous example of this new power is Martin Waldseemüller's world map of 1507. It was on this printed sheet that a new continent, born from the voyages of Amerigo Vespucci, was given a name for the very first time: America. That name, printed over and over, spread across Europe with a speed that was previously unimaginable, cementing a new geographical reality in the public mind. Maps were no longer just for kings and clerics. They became commodities for anyone with the coin to buy one. This created a powerful new cycle of discovery. An explorer would return with new information. A cartographer would swiftly incorporate it into a revised map, and the printing press would send that updated knowledge back out into the world within months. The next wave of sailors would then embark with the most current charts available, allowing them to push even further, find even more, and feed their own discoveries back into the hungry machine. This feedback loop turned exploration from a series of isolated gambles into a coordinated, continent-wide enterprise. It was this technological shift, this ability to standardize and disseminate geographical truth, that provided the essential nervous system for the vast, state-sponsored empires now stretching their fingers across the globe. The line drawn by Pope Alexander VI in 1494 was a cartographic fantasy, a perfect meridian slicing through an ocean he could not imagine. This was the Treaty of Tordesillas, a simple stroke of a pen that divided the entire globe between Spain and Portugal. It awarded all lands to the west of the line to Spain, and all lands to the east to Portugal, creating a neat, binary world out of a messy, unknown one. The audacity of this act is hard to overstate. It was the ultimate expression of a mindset forged by centuries of medieval mapmaking, where terra incognita was not someone's home, but a prize to be allocated. The line paid no heed to the great empires of the Aztecs and the Inca, or the complex kingdoms of West Africa. It ignored the people, the cultures, and the histories that already filled those spaces, because on the maps the European powers used, those spaces were either blank or populated by monsters, not sovereign nations. This single, arbitrary line on a parchment map would dictate the language, religion, and colonial history of entire continents, from Brazil speaking Portuguese to the rest of Latin America speaking Spanish. The legacy of this pen stroke echoes in the straight, unnatural borders you see on a world map today. So many of the lines that divide modern nations were not drawn by local populations following rivers or mountain ranges. They were imposed from afar by colonial administrators who, much like the medieval monks, saw the world as a diagram to be partitioned. They used rulers and compasses to carve up Africa and the Middle East, creating states that grouped rival ethnicities together and split ancient homelands in two. The conflicts that flare up along these borders are often blamed on age-old tribal hatreds, but their true origin is far more recent. They are the ghostly afterimage of a medieval worldview, a reminder that the most dangerous lines are not those drawn by swords, but those drawn by quills on a map, mistaking imagination for authority and turning geography into destiny. That final, quiet scratch of the quill was never just an ending. It was the beginning of everything. The world of the medieval mapmaker was a breathtaking fusion of faith, fear, and a desperate, burgeoning knowledge, a place where imagined lands held as much power as real coastlines. The quest for Prester John's kingdom did not just fill space on a parchment, it redirected the flow of global exploration, sending ships toward real continents in pursuit of a phantom king. The psychological grip of terra incognita, those empty spaces on the chart, did not signal ignorance but issued a compelling invitation to conquest, transforming blank areas into realms of divine destiny and imperial ambition. These cartographic creations were never simple mistakes. They were active, living forces. They directed the routes of exploration, provided the moral justification for conquest, and ultimately forged the very concept of a global empire, built on a foundation of lines that separated the civilized from the monstrous, the saved from the damned. They stand as a permanent reminder that every map is an argument. It is a vision of the world, meticulously crafted to reflect the deep-seated biases, the soaring ambitions, and the limited knowledge of the people who drew it. It is a story told in coastlines and borders, a narrative of power. So as we glance at the glowing digital maps on our own screens, we must pause to ask a vital question. What unseen assumptions are we still navigating? What imagined boundaries, drawn not by rivers or mountains but by data and algorithms, are silently guiding our choices, our politics, and our sense of the world? The legacy of those ancient chart makers endures not in the parchment they left behind, but in the profound challenge they pose to us today, to look beyond the lines we draw and to see the immense power hidden within them.